The night before the Challenger launched, an engineer named Roger Boisjoly stood in a conference room and told his bosses, and NASA, that 7 astronauts could die in the morning. He had the data, he had the photographs, he had a memo he'd written 6 months earlier warning of exactly this, and he was overruled anyway. 14 hours later, 73 seconds after liftoff, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart in the sky over the Atlantic, live on television, in front of millions of schoolchildren watching because a teacher was on board. This is the story of the men who saw it coming, and the room where they were told to stop thinking like engineers. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand a small rubber ring. The Space Shuttle didn't fly on its own power alone. Strapped to its sides were 2 solid rocket boosters, each one built in segments, stacked together like sections of a steel drum, then shipped to Florida and assembled on site. Where those segments met, there was a joint, and that joint needed to seal shut with absolute reliability, because inside it, at the moment of ignition, burned gas at temperatures over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, under enormous pressure, trying to find any way out. The seal came down to 2 rubber O-rings per joint, simple circular gaskets, not much different in principle from something you'd find in a garden hose. When the rocket ignited, the joint would flex slightly, and the O-ring was supposed to expand instantly to fill the gap before hot gas could escape. It was a design built on a narrow assumption that the rubber would respond fast enough, every time, under every condition. Nobody had truly tested what happened when that rubber was cold. Rubber stiffens in the cold. Anyone who has left a garden hose outside in winter knows this instinctively. Cold rubber resists being squeezed and stretched. It takes longer to spring back into shape. And in a shuttle launch, longer is not a small delay. It is milliseconds that decide whether hot gas is stopped or whether it finds a path through. The engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company in Utah that manufactured the boosters for NASA, had started to notice this problem years before Challenger ever flew. There was also a second, more subtle issue with the joint itself, something engineers called joint rotation. Under the force of ignition, the metal casing of the booster would flex and bend at the seam, and for a brief moment the gap the O-ring needed to fill would actually widen rather than close. In warm rubber, that widening happened fast enough that the seal kept pace. In cold rubber, it didn't. The ring, stiff and sluggish, could momentarily lose contact with the metal altogether, leaving a narrow opening for scorching gas to slip through before the ring caught up. It was a flaw baked into the joint's geometry from the very beginning, and it had nothing to do with bad luck. It had to do with physics that got worse, predictably and measurably, as the thermometer dropped. In January of 1985, a full year before the disaster, the shuttle Discovery launched in unusually cold weather, around 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest launch up to that point. When engineers recovered the boosters afterward, they found something they hadn't seen before. Black soot had blown past the primary O-ring and scorched its way toward the secondary seal. The ring hadn't failed completely, but it had failed to do its job quickly. It was evidence, sitting right there in the hardware, that cold weather was eating away at the shuttle's margin of safety. Roger Boisjoly was one of the engineers who studied that soot. He was one of Thiokol's most experienced seal specialists, a man who had spent years working on the joint design and understood its behavior better than almost anyone else at the company. What he saw troubled him enough that he decided to put it, clearly, in writing. On July 31, 1985, he sent an internal memo to Thiokol's Vice President of Engineering, Robert Lund. The subject line read, O-ring erosion / potential failure criticality. In it, Boisjoly described the danger in a joint plainly. If a primary O-ring failed to seat properly, he wrote, then it is a jump ball whether the secondary ring behind it could pressurize in time to save the seal. And if it couldn't, the result would be, in his own words, a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. He wasn't speculating. He was extrapolating directly from flight data, and he asked, urgently, for the company to dedicate a team to solving the joint problem before it caught up with them in the air. Thiokol did respond, at least on paper. A SEAL task force was created that same August, and Boisjoly was assigned to it. But almost immediately, the team found itself starved of the resources, authority, and management attention it needed to actually fix anything. Meetings got postponed. Requests for new hardware and test time moved slowly through the approval chain. Boisjoly grew frustrated enough that, in October of 1985, he wrote a second memo, this one warning that the task force itself was being blocked from doing its job. noting that even people at NASA had started to notice the team wasn't getting the support it needed. Still, 6 months later, when Challenger sat on the launch pad in January, the joint design hadn't changed. The warning had been filed. The rocket had not. Now move forward to January 27, 1986, the night before launch. Challenger's flight had already been delayed several times, first by weather, then by a stuck bolt on the hatch. NASA was under pressure. The launch had been pushed back so many times that it had become a public relations problem, and there was talk of comparing shuttle turnaround times to those of a scheduled airline. There was also a specific reason NASA wanted this particular launch to go smoothly. President Reagan was scheduled to deliver his State of the Union address that very evening, and it had been arranged for him to mention the shuttle live, with Krista McAuliffe already teaching a lesson from orbit. A delay wouldn't just cost a day. It would cost a moment NASA had spent months building toward. Then a new forecast came in. Overnight temperatures at Kennedy Space Center were expected to drop into the low 20s Fahrenheit, colder than any previous shuttle launch by a wide margin. That triggered alarm bells at Thiokol immediately, because the coldest prior launch, the one that had produced the sooty O-ring, had been 53 degrees. Nobody had flown anywhere close to freezing. Thiokol engineers in Utah requested the teleconference themselves, before NASA even asked for one. They wanted to raise the alarm before anyone had a chance to assume the cold didn't matter. That evening, NASA and Thiokol engineers held an emergency teleconference, dozens of people on the line, spread between Kennedy Space Center in Florida, Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, and Thiokol's plant in Utah. Boisjoly and his colleague Arnie Thompson led the technical case against launching. They walked through the data from that cold January flight a year earlier. They showed that the colder the O-ring, the slower it responded, and the more erosion showed up on recovered hardware. Their conclusion was blunt. Launch temperatures below 53 degrees were outside anything they had flight history for, and the predicted 29-degree reading the next morning was a leap into the unknown. On the NASA side, the reaction was not gratitude for the warning. It was frustration. Engineers at Marshall pushed back hard, pointing out that the data didn't show a clean, unambiguous correlation, since a few cold weather tests hadn't shown erosion either, and a couple of warm weather launches had shown some erosion too. From a purely statistical standpoint, on a chart with too few data points, the pattern could look messier than Boisjoly knew it to be in practice. One NASA official, Lawrence Malloy, reportedly asked when Thiokol expected them to launch, next April. The tone of the call shifted from a technical review into something closer to a cross-examination, engineers being asked to prove a negative, to demonstrate with certainty that a launch would fail, rather than being asked whether they could guarantee it would succeed. That reversal of the burden of proof, safety having to be disproven rather than assumed, would later be singled out by investigators as one of the clearest signs that the culture around the shuttle program had quietly inverted itself over the years. Under that pressure, Thiokol's management asked for a private caucus off the phone line to reconsider its position. And this is the moment that engineering ethics courses still teach decades later. Inside that room, Thiokol's senior vice president, Jerry Mason, turned to Robert Lund, the vice president of engineering, the same man who had received Boisjoly's memo 6 months before, and told him to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. It sounds almost like a throwaway line. It was not. It was an instruction to stop weighing the physics of the joint and start weighing the politics of the relationship with NASA. Lund did. He changed his position. And the room, made up almost entirely of managers now rather than engineers, voted to recommend launch. Boisjoly and Thompson were still in the room, and they tried to stop it. One of them stood up, walked to the table, and laid out photographs of the eroded O-ring from the cold weather flight, trying to make the danger physically visible rather than abstract. It didn't change the outcome. Boisjoly later said he felt he had failed to get through to anyone, that he watched the decision get made and understood in that moment that the engineers had lost. When the teleconference resumed, Thiokol reversed its earlier recommendation to delay. The company that built the boosters now told NASA it was clear to fly. There was one more act of resistance that night. Alan McDonald, the director of Thiokol's booster rocket project, was at Kennedy Space Center in person, and it was ordinarily his job to sign the final certification of readiness for launch on behalf of the company. He would not do it. McDonald told NASA officials directly that he believed launching under these conditions was taking a risk they shouldn't be taking. citing not only the O-ring concern but a third worry as well. Freezing overnight temperatures had coated the launch pad itself in ice, and there was a real danger that chunks of it could shake loose at liftoff and strike the orbiter's fragile heat shield tiles, the same tiles that protected the crew during re-entry. He refused to put his name on the form, so Thiokol's management back in Utah signed off instead and faxed their approval to Kennedy Space Center in his place. The launch was authorized without the one man on site who had spent the night arguing against it ever agreeing to it. McDonald would later say simply that he thought they were taking risks nobody needed to take, and that if something went wrong, he didn't want his name attached to the decision that let it happen. The next morning, January 28, 1986, temperatures at the launch pad had fallen to around 36 degrees Fahrenheit at ground level, though the joints themselves, exposed all night to the cold air, were likely colder still. Some estimates put the right-hand booster's field joint down near 28 degrees at the moment of ignition, well below anything the O-rings had ever been tested at, let alone flown at. Icicles hung from the launch tower's handrails and water pipes that morning, some of them a foot long, and NASA's own ice inspection team had flagged the pad as a concern hours before liftoff. Still, the launch proceeded. Challenger lifted off at 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time. 7 crew members were aboard: Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialist Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher from Concord, New Hampshire, chosen from over 11,000 applicants to be the first ordinary citizen to fly to space, a choice that had put the mission in classrooms across the country that morning, with students in New Hampshire and beyond gathered around television sets to watch their teacher launch into orbit. 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger broke apart. A puff of smoke had actually been visible near the right booster's joint in the first second of ignition, exactly the joint Boisjoly had warned about, exactly where cold rubber failed to seal fast enough. Hot gas burned through. A flame plume grew, and it eventually breached the external fuel tank, leading to the structural failure of the entire vehicle. All 7 crew members were killed. The nation watched it happen live. In the investigation that followed, President Reagan formed the Rogers Commission to determine what went wrong, a panel that included astronaut Neil Armstrong and physicist Richard Feynman, whose own live demonstration of dunking a piece of O-ring material in a glass of ice water, showing the whole room how brittle it became, turned into one of the most famous moments of the hearings. But it was Boisjoly and McDonald who supplied the evidence that made that demonstration possible in the first place. Both men testified, and their testimony became some of the most consequential the commission received. Boisjoly brought his July 1985 memo with him, the one warning of a catastrophe of the highest order, and gave it to investigators. He described in detail the teleconference the night before launch, the data he'd presented, and the moment Lund was told to change hats. McDonald testified about refusing to sign the launch approval, and about the pressure NASA had applied to get Thiokol to reverse its recommendation. Neither man had to volunteer this information. Thiokol's own leadership had not planned to raise the prior night's objections publicly, and internal accounts suggest company officials were unhappy when McDonald and Boisjoly answered commissioners' questions candidly rather than staying quiet. Their testimony directly exposed a decision-making process that had overridden its own engineers under schedule pressure, and it became the backbone of the commission's finding that the accident was not simply a mechanical failure, but an organizational one. Speaking out came at a personal cost to both men. Inside Thiokol, Boisjoly and McDonald found themselves professionally isolated after the hearings, reassigned, sidelined, treated by some colleagues as if they had betrayed the company rather than told the truth about it. Boisjoly eventually left Thiokol and struggled for years afterward, both with the loss of his career trajectory and with the psychological weight of having watched a disaster he had tried and failed to prevent. Both men were later recognized publicly for their conduct. The American Association for the Advancement of Science gave them its award for scientific freedom and responsibility for their integrity in coming forward, an acknowledgement that what looked, inside the company, like disloyalty had in fact been exactly what engineering ethics demands. The Rogers Commission's final report, released in June of 1986, identified 2 failures. The first was physical. The O-ring seals were never certified to operate at the temperatures Challenger launched in, and they failed to seal the joint as designed. The second was organizational, and the commission was direct about it, describing a flawed decision-making process in which safety concerns raised by engineers were overridden by managers responding to schedule and communication pressures, without the full picture ever reaching the highest levels of NASA leadership. In other words, the people who understood the risk best were the people with the least power to stop the launch. That gap between technical knowledge and organizational authority is what the commission ultimately blamed as much as the rubber ring itself. The aftermath reshaped how NASA thought about safety. The shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years while the joints were redesigned, adding a third seal and electric heaters to keep the O-rings warm before launch. NASA created a new Office of Safety, Reliability and Quality Assurance reporting directly to the administrator, specifically so that engineering objections would be harder to bury inside a chain of command, eager to keep to a schedule. And the case entered engineering classrooms almost immediately, taught for decades since not as a story about a rubber ring, but as a study in what happens when the people closest to a risk are told their job, in that moment, is not to be right but to be agreeable. Business schools use it too, alongside case studies on groupthink and normalization of deviance, the slow process by which an organization gets used to a warning sign, decides nothing bad happened last time, and quietly redefines an anomaly as acceptable. That pattern, engineers flagging a risk and management discounting it because previous close calls hadn't yet become disasters, would surface again 17 years later in the investigation into the loss of the Shuttle Columbia in 2003. The tragedy of Challenger was never that no one saw it coming. Someone did. He wrote it down. He brought the photographs. He stood in the room and argued as hard as he could the night before. What failed wasn't the engineering. It was the willingness of an organization to listen to it when the answer was inconvenient. And that's the part of this story that has outlasted the shuttle program itself. The reminder that the most dangerous moment in any high-stakes decision isn't when the warning is missing. It's when the warning is right there and gets overruled anyway.